Hey you, welcome back to Secrets with Maeve, the space for the conversations we usually keep to ourselves. I'm Maeve. Today, we're talking about something I know so many of us struggle with in silence. Why she goes cold overnight. 7. Psychological truths. She's secretly testing you don't ignore. 4. Let's get into it. She didn't become distant overnight. You just started noticing the distance when it no longer felt safe to ignore. At first, everything felt natural. Her energy was warm, her attention effortless, her presence consistent. Conversations flowed without resistance. You didn't have to question where you stood because her behavior made it clear. And then without warning, something shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough for you to feel it. Her replies became shorter. The pauses between messages grew longer. The enthusiasm that once felt genuine started to feel measured, controlled, and suddenly you found yourself thinking more than before. Rereading conversations, analyzing tone, wondering what changed. This is where most men misunderstand. They assume something went wrong, that interest faded, that attraction disappeared, or worse, that they made a mistake they can't identify. So they react. They try harder. They give more attention, more reassurance, more effort, believing that if they can just return things to how they were, everything will feel right again. But what's actually happening beneath the surface is far more complex than simple loss of interest. You're focusing on what she does instead of why she does it, because when a woman starts acting cold, it's rarely random, it's rarely meaningless, and it's almost never as simple as she doesn't like you anymore. In many cases, this shift is intentional, not in a manipulative way, but in a deeply psychological one. It's a form of observation. She's watching what you do when things are no longer easy. When her energy changes, she's not just pulling back. She's creating space. And in that space, your behavior becomes more visible, more honest, less filtered by comfort. Think about it carefully. When everything feels secure, you operate on autopilot. You're relaxed, predictable. But when something feels uncertain, you reveal more of who you really are. Your reactions become real-time reflections of your mindset, your confidence, your emotional stability. And this is exactly where the dynamic begins to shift. Because now, instead of her showing you who she is, she's watching you show who you are. The silence, the distance, the subtle coldness, it creates a kind of emotional pressure, not overwhelming, but enough to make you question your position. And once that questioning begins, your actions start to change. Some men become more attentive, almost urgently so. They try to fix what they believe is broken. Others become anxious, overthinking every detail, looking for reassurance that no longer comes as easily. And some pull away entirely, assuming the connection is already lost, but none of these reactions are truly conscious. They're responses to discomfort. And that's the point. Because in moments like this, she's not just observing what you say, she's observing how you handle emotional uncertainty, how you respond when control is no longer in your hands, how stable you remain when her behavior no longer gives you clarity. This is where the emotional test begins, quietly, subtly, without being announced, not because she's trying to play games, but because attraction for her is deeply tied to how you carry yourself when things aren't perfectly aligned. And the moment you start chasing clarity instead of holding your own emotional center, the dynamic begins to tilt. What feels like her pulling away is actually her stepping back just enough to see if you lean too far forward. Because attraction isn't only built in moments of connection, it's revealed in moments of tension. And right now, whether you realize it or not, you're being read more closely than ever before. What you're experiencing right now isn't random behavior. It's a psychological shift driven by emotional calibration. When a woman begins to act cold, what's actually happening beneath the surface is not a loss of feeling, but a reevaluation of it. Attraction for her is not static. It isn't something that simply stays once it's created. It's something that constantly adjusts based on how she perceives you in changing emotional environments. And when things become too predictable, too certain, something important starts to fade. Uncertainty. This is where most men misunderstand. They believe stability is what maintains attraction, that consistency alone keeps everything strong. And while stability creates comfort, too much of it, without emotional depth, removes the very tension that keeps attraction alive. Because psychologically, attraction is tied to contrast. Warmth feels stronger when it's not constant. Attention feels valuable when it's not always guaranteed. And your presence feels more meaningful when it isn't completely predictable. So when she starts pulling back, she's not just creating distance, she's restoring emotional balance. You're focusing on what she does instead of why she does it. When everything was flowing easily, she already understood your interest. She felt your attention. There was no question about where you stood. But over time, something subtle may have happened. You became more available than intriguing. Not in a negative way, but in a way that made your behavior easy to read. And when someone becomes easy to read, the emotional stimulation begins to drop. So what does she do? She creates a shift, not to confuse you, but to feel you again. Because what's actually happening beneath the surface is a test of emotional response, not in the sense of right or wrong answers, but in the way you handle change. When her behavior cools down, she's watching for something very specific. Does your energy remain grounded or does it start to fluctuate? Do you stay composed or do you begin to seek validation? Do you continue leading your own emotional state or do you start reacting to hers? This matters more than most men realize because attraction at a deeper level is connected to emotional self-control, not suppression, but stability. The ability to remain centered even when external signals become unclear. And when she senses that your emotional state depends on her behavior, something shifts inside her perception, not consciously but instinctively. It begins to feel like she holds the emotional weight of the interaction. And once that happens, the dynamic becomes unbalanced. So the distance you feel isn't just space. It's a way for her to observe whether you anchor yourself or attach yourself to her reactions. Because when a man becomes reactive, he unintentionally communicates something powerful. He shows that his emotional clarity comes from her, not from within himself. And this is where attraction quietly weakens. Not because she wants it to, but because the emotional polarity begins to collapse. But here's the deeper layer most don't see. She's not only observing your reaction to her distance, she's also reconnecting with her own feelings. Distance allows her to feel again without influence, without your constant presence shaping the interaction. She can assess what she genuinely feels when you're not actively trying to maintain the connection. And this is critical because real attraction isn't just about how things feel when you're present. It's about how she feels in your absence. So when she becomes cold, she's stepping back into that space where her emotions can reset, where clarity can return, and where your behavior becomes more revealing than your words. And in that space, every small reaction you have begins to carry more weight than ever before. Not because she's judging you harshly, but because she's trying to understand you more deeply. The silence, the delay, the reduced warmth. It's all part of a psychological environment where truth becomes visible. And the truth she's looking for isn't whether you like her. She already knows that what she's trying to understand is something far more important. Who you are. When she stops making it easy for you, if you slow down and really observe her behavior, you'll start to notice something subtle, but incredibly revealing. Her coldness isn't consistent. It comes and goes. One moment, she feels distant, almost detached, and then unexpectedly, she warms up again. A playful message, a moment of attention, a brief return to how things used to feel. And just when you begin to relax, she pulls back again. This pattern is not accidental. It's emotional contrast. And what's actually happening beneath the surface is far more intentional than it appears. You're focusing on what she does instead of why she does it. Because if she truly lost interest, the pattern would be different. There would be no return of warmth, no curiosity, no small windows where her energy softens again. It would simply fade consistently without interruption. But that's not what's happening here. Instead, she's creating a rhythm: distance, then closeness, silence, then presence, coolness, then warmth. This rhythm does something very specific to your psychology. It keeps you engaged. It creates anticipation. And most importantly, it reveals how you respond to emotional inconsistency. This is where most men misunderstand. They interpret these shifts as mixed signals, confusion, even manipulation. And because of that, they try to force stability. They try to fix the inconsistency by asking questions, seeking clarity, or pushing for reassurance. But what they don't realize is that the inconsistency itself is the message. Because when her behavior isn't predictable, your reactions become more honest. You can't rely on routine anymore. You can't lean on certainty. So instead, you start reacting in real time based on how you feel in each moment. And this is exactly what she's observing. Not your words, but your patterns. Does her distance make you chase harder? Does her silence make you anxious? Does her brief warmth make you overly invested again, or do you remain steady, unaffected by the fluctuation? Because in these small emotional shifts, she's reading something deeper than surface behavior. She's reading your emotional consistency. And consistency in this context doesn't mean always behaving the same way. It means maintaining your internal state regardless of external change. But there's another layer to this pattern that's even more revealing. Her moments of warmth are not just random, they're checkpoints. They're subtle ways of reconnecting just enough to see if your energy has changed. If you became more reactive, she feels it. If you became more grounded, she feels that too. And based on what she feels, the pattern continues or evolves. This is why the cycle can repeat, because she's not only testing your reaction to distance, she's also measuring how you respond when she gives you attention again. Most men fail here without realizing it. When she becomes warm again, they relax too quickly, they overinvest, they lean in with more intensity than before, almost as if they're trying to secure the connection before it disappears again. But what this communicates on a psychological level is dependence. It shows that your emotional state rises and falls based on her behavior, and once that pattern becomes visible, the dynamic becomes predictable again, which leads her to pull back once more. Not to hurt you, but to reintroduce that uncertainty, because uncertainty reveals truth, and truth is what she's searching for. Who are you when things are unclear? Who are you when her attention isn't consistent? Who are you when you don't know exactly where you stand? These questions are never asked directly. They're observed through patterns, through timing, through subtle emotional shifts that seem small but carry significant meaning. And the more you react to the pattern, the more the pattern continues. Because from her perspective, she's not just interacting with you. She's studying how stable your presence is in an unstable emotional environment. And whether you realize it or not, every response you give is shaping how she sees you, not in a single moment, but across the pattern as a whole. This is the point where most men lose clarity, not because her behavior is confusing, but because their interpretation of it is. They see distance and they assume disinterest. They feel inconsistency and they label it as instability. And without realizing it, they begin reacting to a story they've created instead of the reality that's actually unfolding. This is where most men misunderstand. They believe their role is to restore what was lost, to bring things back to how they were in the beginning. So they increase effort. They become more available, more accommodating, more focused on her responses than their own state. But what's actually happening beneath the surface is the opposite of what they think. The more you try to stabilize her behavior, the more you destabilize your own, because when your focus shifts entirely onto her, her replies, her tone, her attention, you slowly disconnect from something essential, your center. You're focusing on what she does instead of why she does it. And once that shift happens, your behavior begins to change in subtle but noticeable ways. You start anticipating her reactions before they happen. You adjust your words to avoid losing her interest. You hesitate before expressing yourself fully. You become careful, measured, slightly uncertain. And while this might feel like you're protecting the connection, what you're actually doing is weakening your presence within it. Because attraction is not built on perfection. It's built on emotional certainty, not certainty about the outcome, but certainty within yourself. And when that internal certainty begins to fade, it creates a quiet imbalance. She can feel it, not logically, but emotionally. Because when a man is grounded, his energy is consistent, not rigid, not cold, but steady. There's a sense of direction in how he communicates, in how he responds, in how he exists within the interaction. But when he starts reacting to her shifts instead of observing them, that steadiness begins to break. And this is where the dynamic changes. She no longer feels like she's experiencing you. She feels like she's influencing you. And that difference is subtle but powerful, because the moment she senses that her behavior controls your emotional state, something instinctive happens. She leans back, not consciously, not intentionally, but naturally, because attraction requires a certain level of resistance, a sense that the other person exists independently of your reactions. And when that independence disappears, so does the tension that creates attraction. This is why trying to fix her coldness often leads to more distance, because the act of fixing implies that something is wrong, and more importantly, that you're affected by it. And the more affected you appear, the more the dynamic shifts out of balance. But here's the mindset shift that changes everything. Instead of asking, why is she acting this way? You begin asking, why is this affecting me this much? That question brings your focus back to where it should be. Not on controlling her behavior, but on understanding your own. Because her actions are not something you can manage, but your responses. And when you stop trying to chase clarity from her and start creating clarity within yourself, something shifts. You become less reactive, less dependent on immediate feedback, more present in your own energy. And this doesn't mean you become distant or indifferent. It means you become stable. There's a difference. Indifference pushes people away. Stability allows them to come closer without pressure. Because when you're no longer trying to force the dynamic into a specific direction, you create space for it to reveal itself naturally. And in that space, something interesting happens. Her behavior begins to adjust, not because you asked for it, but because the dynamic has changed. You're no longer chasing her energy. You're holding your own. And that more than anything you could say or do is what resets the balance, not by controlling her actions, but by no longer being controlled by them. At this stage, everything becomes quieter but clearer. There's no longer a need to decode every message, analyze every pause, or search for hidden meanings in her behavior. Because once you understand what's actually happening beneath the surface, the urgency begins to fade. Not because you stop caring, but because you start seeing differently. Her coldness no longer feels like rejection. It feels like information. You're focusing on what she does instead of why she does it. And now that shift in perspective gives you something most men never reach in these situations. Control. Not control over her, but control over yourself. Because the truth is, her behavior may still fluctuate. There may still be moments where she feels distant, followed by moments where she reconnects. That rhythm doesn't always disappear immediately, but your relationship to it changes completely. You no longer react to every shift. You observe. You no longer chase clarity through her responses. You create clarity through your own consistency. And this is where everything starts to realign. Because when your emotional state is no longer tied to her behavior, something subtle begins to happen. The pressure disappears. She no longer feels like she has to manage your reactions. She no longer senses that her distance creates instability in you. And because of that, her need to create that distance begins to fade. Not because you demanded it, but because it's no longer necessary. This is what most men never realize. Her tests are not designed to push you away. They exist to reveal whether you can remain grounded when things aren't certain. And once that question is answered consistently, the dynamic shifts on its own. Because what's actually happening beneath the surface is not about winning her attention, it's about maintaining your presence. There's a difference. Attention can be gained through effort, through words, through actions, but presence is something she feels. It's in how you respond without rushing, how you speak without over-explaining, how you exist in the interaction without trying to control where it's going. And when that presence becomes steady, something changes in her perception. She begins to relax, not in the sense that she becomes predictable again, but in the sense that she no longer needs to question your emotional stability because you've already shown it, not once, not occasionally, but consistently. And consistency in this context is not about always saying the right thing. It's about being the same person, regardless of the situation. That's what creates trust. That's what sustains attraction. And that's what removes the need for these subtle tests in the first place. So when she pulls back now, you don't rush forward. When she becomes quiet, you don't fill the silence with uncertainty. You remain where you are, grounded, aware, unaffected in the ways that matter. And ironically, that's what draws her closer. Not your effort, not your overthinking, but your stability. Because in a space where emotions can shift so easily, the one thing that stands out is someone who doesn't. And that's the final realization. She didn't start acting cold to push you away. She stepped back to see if you would lose yourself trying to keep her. And the moment you stop doing that is the moment everything becomes simple again. If this made you see things differently, subscribe, because understanding her mind changes.